Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's broadcast from the Marin Symphony. I am delighted to welcome as my special guest today somebody that actually really needs no introduction to Marin audiences, one of my closest friends and collaborators for more than 25 years ago, the concertmaster of the Marin Symphony, Jeremy Constant. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, Alasdair. It's nice to be here with you.
Nice to hear and see you, and especially that very striking and beautiful virtual background. I'm assuming it's a virtual background and you're not buried in some beautiful sylvan glade at this point. Maybe we should start our conversation by telling us a little bit about what this beautiful photograph behind you is.
Well, it's a disguise for whatever's behind me in real life. So I'm very grateful to Zoom to have this ability. The photo I chose was my wife and I, Sharon, are amongst other hobbies. We enjoy bird photography, and so we have pretty good lens setup, each of us, that's complementary, so that I can get shots that she can't. But a few years back, we heard of the first great gray owl that had been spotted in California in almost 50 years. And I had enough time where we could do a road trip, a 6-hour drive up to the Redwood State and National Park on the border of California and Oregon. To look for this bird, which we were lucky enough to find. And the photo behind me represents the forest that we were in photographing. So we've got our good birding rigs. And I try and always make a habit of turning around and grabbing the cell phone and taking a shot of the environment we're in, just to give it context. And so that's, we had remarkably nice lighting and a beautiful environment, and I thought I'd use that as the background.
Well, it's a beautiful background, absolutely, and it's also an interesting glimpse of something that I think it's worth talking about, is what and for which I think there's interest from our public, and that's what musicians get up to in their downtime. So this is obviously one of your hobbies, but it's by no means the only one, and maybe the more remarkable one is the thing that I'd like you to talk about, and that's your relationship with planes.
It's been going on for quite a while now. I had been working professionally for probably 15 years, at which point I had enough excess money to pursue admittedly rather expensive learning endeavor, and that was learning to fly. Sharon said, now that we've got some money, you need to go out and fly, because she was getting really irritated with every time we would drive by an airport, I'd go, hey, look, an airport or a plane. And so she recognized the need in me to get in the air. So I got my license in 1996. And in that process, I was renting airplanes, and I tried to be as meticulous as possible. And what would happen is you do a pre-flight examination of the airplane you're proposing to rent. And almost every time I would go up, I'd spot something. I'd have to go and find a mechanic, bring him over and point to whatever it is I'd spotted and say, is that okay? And very often the response was, it should be, which didn't really inspire confidence. So I bought a very, very used plane to learn how to maintain them. I got very good mentorship. If Walt Disney had designed an airplane, it would be the airplane I bought. It was a 1965 Air Coupe. So I learned to maintain planes on that airplane with adult supervision and the proper FAA sign-offs. And my mentor was remarkably generous with his time and his expertise. And it was the plane I had gotten was something I wouldn't really trust to fly anywhere but the Central Valley. It didn't climb very well. It wasn't very fast. I remember one particular day when I was flying over Interstate 80, Interstate 5, and the trucks on the interstate were actually going faster than I was. And
A little
at
Billy.
a certain point, you realize that you have to look at how much fuel you've got to make sure that you've got enough to get back. And the stronger the wind blows in the wrong direction, the more likely you're going to be to have to find someplace to refuel. So I had been kind of thinking about doing something a little higher performance. The cost was prohibitive. And then I found out that you could actually build your own, an experimental home-built aircraft. And there ensued a 7-year project of building an airplane with my mentor. It was flying in 2010, did all sorts of modifications and got it exactly right, then had it painted in 2013, and I've been flying it all over the country in my off time and just absolutely loving it.
That's an amazing story. I have to say that I'm just I admire that on so many levels. It is so way beyond anything that I could conceive of doing myself. I feel like I'm a one-trick pony. But I guess one thing that occurs to me is like, so have you found, or did you find in the process of construction and in the continuing flying that your training as a musician brought anything to bear? Were the kind of discipline that you needed to have as a musician, is it in any way related to flying or constructing a plane?
On a number of levels. First of all, both endeavors on certain foundational levels are about joy. Just bringing joy to the environment, either to myself or to an audience in the case of music. I love taking people for flights and sharing that joy. The process of learning how to fly and of building is one that is tremendously dependent on tenacity. And that's very similar to learning an instrument. You will inevitably come across real frustrations. And at each point, you have to decide, am I satisfied with where I'm at now? Or do I muster the wherewithal to push through on faith that you will reach another level? And both airplane building and learning to fly and learning an instrument are about overcoming frustrations to get better.
Fascinating. Yeah, and it seems to me also that there's a great deal of mental discipline involved in both, and attention to detail. I mean, I know as a musician that that all of us as musicians have this fanatical approach to dealing with the text that we have in front of us, and we'll have endless debates on how long a quarter note is, for God's sake. Luckily, the consequences of perhaps inattention to detail on our part of musicians are less life-threatening than they might be as a pilot, right? So the stakes must be different.
Yeah, I was fortunate to get interviewed by a wonderful aviation author, Lane Wallace, who also had a little experience with music, in high school and stuff. And she used a quote from somebody else where she said, well, when you're on stage and you're frightened to death, at least it's a death you can live with. Whereas in aviation, not so much.
Yeah, I find myself saying that when thinking to myself when we get into these issues of I wouldn't say arguments, but just all of the things that we deal with as musicians back and forth. I keep thinking to myself, you know what? It's just music. It's just music. As important as it is, it's also important to get perspective. I wanted to mention that during the course of this interview, we're going to have the opportunity to field a couple of questions that have come in through email for you and me from supporters. And if I could throw one of these your way, a question
Sure.
from Indy Young, and actually it's 2 or 3 parters. Are you still flying your home built? Are you allowed to during this time? And are you building anything new?
Yes, I am still flying, although sporadically, just because of the travel and, I'm trying to respect the social isolation. Although at the airport, we each have our own hangars, and I don't take anybody with me. I'm sort of in the beginning stages of training for a new aviation rating, an instrument rating that is to enable me to fly in the clouds. But I've had to put that on hold because it requires the instructor sitting right next to you, and we can't do that. Mechanical devices of all kinds don't do well just sitting. So in order to keep the airplane, which Sharon and I affectionately named Stella, for Stella Luna, and if you see the artwork on the tail, Sharon did an illustration of the bat across a full moon from the children's story Stella Luna. But anyway, to keep Stella in good shape, she needs to be exercised a certain minimum amount. Whenever we go off on tour, I try and fly her right before and then right after, because just sitting, all the lubricants drain out and things can start to get crunchy. So I'm reminded of someone who's a friend who's a military fighter pilot, who said there are single seat fighters where it's just the pilot in the plane. And he said, the great thing about flying single seat is the quality of the social relationship. And so I'm having a little bit of that in social isolation with Stella and nobody in the right seat.
There's a line from a Noel Coward play, if I can bring it to mind. It's somebody is getting off a plane and is asked how the flight was, and they say, aeronautically, it was a great success. Socially, it left quite a bit to be desired.
That's right.
But you mentioned about keeping the plane safe and not too creaky. What are you doing to keep your violin playing nicely oiled and not too creaky during this time of quarantine?
Well, for my own personality is such that unless I have something to be afraid of public embarrassment about, I generally tend not to keep as active as I should, although I do need a break, but not this long. So I've been doing various little videos, which are frankly more terrifying than most people realize, because they're being recorded for posterity, and I'm the recording engineer, which is a horrifying thought. It's, I'm doing it on a phone with the built-in microphone, and so there is a lot to be afraid of with that process. But it does, the prospect of having it be recorded and distributed via internet is terrifying enough that I try to keep in shape.
Yeah, nothing like the pressure of sort of deadlines to get the creative juices flowing. Understandable. That makes sense.